cabeludo, viado, ousado. Tem muito, tem muito, tem muito, tem muito homem. Pois é, tem muito homem. Todo homem que se preza tem que impor respeito, saber ouvir falar, escutar, ter dinheiro, celular, ser bom de cama e te respeitar. E se o homem não tiver nenhuma dessas virtudes, saia de perto e tome uma atitude. Porque o verdadeiro homem, ele te ama, te trata com carinho, com respeito e amor, e vai te dar por toda a vida grandes felicidades, serão felizes. Esse é o homem de verdade, esse é o homem de verdade. Pois é, é esse, é esse. Esse é o homem de verdade. Pois é, pois é. Tem muito homem pelas ruas, nos bares, à noite, de madrugada. É, eu gosto de todos. Tem muito, tem muito, tem muito, tem muito, tem muito, tem muito homem.
Radio Mano Papachango.
Permanece a la escucha. Permanece a la escucha. Permanece a la escucha. Permanece a la escucha.
When you come, I'm feeling better. Sky is blue, you said forever. Oh, oh, I've been dropped by love. Then you go, so change the weather. Sky is gray, beat more than ever. Oh, oh, I've been dropped by love. 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 So my beer not taste so bitter, but I can't find anything sweeter. Oh, oh, I've been dropped by love. Then you come and I feel better. See my eyes, they're full of water. Then again you go, so change the weather. Asking for the next together. I've been dropped by love. I've been trapped by love. I've been trapped by love. I've been trapped by love. When you come, I'm feeling better. Sky is blue, you said forever. Oh, oh, I've been trapped by love. Then you come and I feel better. See my eyes, they're full of water. Then again you go, so change the weather. Asking for the next together. Asking for the next together. I've been trapped by love. 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 I've been trapped by love.
Radio Bemba 00.0.
O bicho do coco entrou minha casa, minha cabeça puxou bala. Bicho do coco entrou minha casa, levou-se toda a minha ilusão. Levou-se os cartos, levou-se a mulher, deixou tormentar nada de comer. O bicho do coco entrou minha casa, mirou meus olhos, a mega falou. Cuando acabe esa fode, hasta ya reventar. Cuando acabe esa fode, o bicho va a pegar. O bicho do coco entró minha casa, minha cabeça puxou essa bala. Bicho do coco entrou minha casa, levou-se toda minha ilusão. Levou-se os cartos, levou-se a mulher, deixou tormentar nada de comer. Bicho do coco entrou minha casa, mirou almoçou e os amiga falou. Quando a cabeça fode, hasta ya reventar. Quando a cabeça fode, o bicho vai pegar. Bicho do coco mandou me matar. Bicho do coco mandou uma cadeia. Bicho do coco quitou libertar. Bicho do coco deixou maquelado. Bicho do coco. O bicho do coco entrou minha casa, minha cabeça puxou a bala. O bicho do coco entrou minha casa, levou-se toda minha ilusão. Levou-se os cartos, levou-se a mulher, deixou tormentar nada de comer. Bicho do coco entrou minha casa, mirou almoçou e essa amiga falou.
Люди всех стран и континентов, через несколько минут могучий космический корабль унесет меня в далекие
Chers amis
просторы
lointains ou très proches, habitants de tous les pays et de tous les continents,
Infinita tristeza.
dans quelques minutes,
Infinita
un puissant
tristeza.
vaisseau cosmique m'emportera loin dans l'espace. J'ai peine à décrire ce que j'éprouve, mais il me semble que j'ai vécu toute ma vie dans l'attente de ce moment-là.
Я испытал большое счастье быть первым в космосе, вступить один на один в небывалый поединок с
J'ai
природой.
vraiment le sentiment d'engager un combat sans précédent avec la nature.
Infinita tristeza. Infinita tristeza. Infinita tristeza. Infinita tristeza. Infinita tristeza.
Le moral est bon, je poursuis le vol. Tout va bien, l'engin fonctionne normalement.
Infinita tristeza. Infinita tristeza. Infinita tristeza.
Говорит Москва.
Mamá,
¿Qué?
Señor presidente.
¿puedo tener hijos?
Ahora no, porque tienes 7
Habla el
años.
presidente.
Pero los tendrás cuando seas mayor y te cases.
¿Quién tiene antes el niño, la madre o el padre?
El padre pone la semilla, como te he dicho, y la madre pone la tierra en que esa semilla hará nacer la flor.
¿Y quién es la flor?
Tú.
¿Por qué no crecen los niños dentro de los papás? Yo ya estoy deseando tener niños. ¿Y tú, Quique?
Ay, aún no.
¿Y tú, Quique? ¿Y tú, Quique?
El médico del pueblo.
¿Y tú, Quique?
Yo siempre estaré a tu lado. Yo siempre estaré a tu
Médico
lado.
del pueblo.
¿Y tú, Quique?
Solo quererse mucho.
¿Y tú, Quique? ¿Y tú, Quique?
Solo
¿Y
quererse
tú,
mucho.
Quique?
Yo siempre estaré a tu lado.
Oye, mamá,
¿Puedo tener niños ya?
Séptima 757. El médico del pueblo. El médico del pueblo. Artritis, asma, diabetes e impotencia.
Hoy tenemos la oportunidad de dirigirnos a todos los niños. Es un momento muy importante, definitivo. Revelaros el secreto más grande de la humanidad. La verdad sobre el nacimiento de los niños.
Mitad y mitad es suficiente.
Radio Mano, Papachango.
Nos hemos decidido a revelaros este misterio porque no consideramos justo el que vosotros, grandes y verdaderos amigos de lo auténtico, os sintáis engañados, no ya por vuestros padres, naturalmente, sino por otras opiniones ignorantes.
¿y qué tienen que hacer el padre y la madre para tener niños?
Solo quererse mucho. Yo siempre estaré a tu lado. Yo siempre estaré a tu lado.
¿Y tú, Quique?
Yo siempre
¿Cómo
estaré a tu lado.
vivimos dentro de ti?
Pues como la luz vive en su lámpara o el agua dentro del vaso. Es como si quisieras ver el interior de mi
Radio
corazón.
Mano, Papachango.
Yo siempre estaré a tu lado. Yo siempre estaré a tu lado. Yo siempre estaré a tu lado.
¿Y tú, Quique?
Yo siempre estaré a tu lado. Yo siempre estaré a tu lado. Yo siempre estaré a tu lado.
¿Y tú, Quique?
Yo siempre.
I don't see Peggy Brevoort, who said she was coming in. Hello?
Hello.
Oh, wait a minute. I don't see Peggy. Hello? Hello?
No.
I'm off. And Stephanie is coming. We'll start in about 2 or 3 minutes.
Nice. Yes. It was fun.
All right.
Dancing and everything. There's our MC.
We've come down. Obviously not.
Hello. Hello.
Does that sound all right, John?
We've come down because normally we get introduced by the owners.
Right.
Have we lost our status?
We have.
We've really come down now, getting introduced by Craig. Okay, Craig, please.
Everyone, please presenting Rick Levine and Jeff Jower with our first installment of Astrology Night for the summer.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you, Craig.
Before we start, can we say a word about this?
Yeah.
We have some postcards here
Right
on the
behind
table, and this is a picture of what San Miguel de Allende looks like. And Jeff and I will be teaching from November 5th through 12th in scenic San Miguel de Allende. This is a magical old colonial town with churches that were built 500 years ago. Is that right? About that. And it's very safe and very serene. It's high desert. This workshop is called Creating Tomorrow with Astrology, and it will be basically a look at the slower moving planets and how they're moving over the next several years, and we'll be doing experiential work with the participants' charts, kind of unfolding strategies for how not to get caught under this tidal wave.
It's open to people who are beginning astrologers, experienced astrologers. Contact Rick or me. Pick up a postcard for more information.
Pass some of these that way, please.
And some of you have been regulars here before and know that Rick and I have had the opportunity to travel to some interesting places, to Mexico and to Bali to teach. And I'd like to introduce our dear astrologer, sister, travel agent, and the creator of the workshops in Bali, Evelyn Roberts.
Who's now going to say a few words. That was plenty.
That's right.
We get paid by the word, not Evelyn.
We have it's a special day today. We had a new moon this afternoon. The sun and moon joined together as they do every lunar month, or as Rick likes to say, month, same word origin. But today's new moon was also a solar eclipse, which makes it a very interesting and very special occasion, because new moons are about the beginning of a new cycle. And the fundamental quality of any new moon, when the sun and the moon join together, is naivete, is a sense of freshness. You know, at the beginning of any journey, we have an opportunity to discover everything, and we know nothing. And a new moon in Gemini, the most curious sign of all, really represents the spark of curiosity that gets us looking at life in every possible direction, and sometimes overloads us with information. But the fact that this was also a solar eclipse makes it quite different.
At 2:02 this afternoon is when it was exact, 2:02 p.m.
In the sign of the twos, in the sign of the twins of Gemini. In a solar eclipse, as the great astrologer Dane Rujar pointed out, the moon passes in front of the sun. The moon representing the inner, the personal, the feminine, the subjective, the past, memory. The moon passing in front of the sun, which is the yang, day, masculine, willful force of living in the present, suggests that we need to go back and remember and to feel, which is the domain of the moon. So our instructions today are appropriately complex or double-tracked, as would be the case in Gemini. The new moon says, go forth and taste new experiences. And the eclipse says, but don't forget to check in, look back, and remember where you're coming from before you push forward.
You know, it takes the moon 2 weeks from the time that it was new to get to maximum light, full. And then it takes 2 weeks again for it to become dark. And then it takes 2 weeks again for it to become light, and 2 weeks again for it to become dark. At an eclipse, it takes about 8 minutes for it to go from absolutely full to completely dark and back to absolutely full again. And it's just a different way of looking at an eclipse, because we're used to this monthly cycle, this rhythm of yin and yang, of growing from the seed of the new moon to the quiet of the new moon, and planting that seed again, and then growing to the next full moon. And then at the new moon again, it's quiet, but all of a sudden at an eclipse, this one and the next ones, which we will be talking about shortly, it's almost like someone's taken 2 weeks to bring the room up to full light, and then 2 weeks to turn it down to dark, and then someone screws with the light switch and flips it back and forth. And it's almost like epileptic kind of causing. You know, if you get that right rhythm, it screws with the nervous system. And that's what's happening here. It's like, has anyone ever been in a total eclipse? I know Evelyn has, because I met her at a total eclipse in Plymouth, England. It's the weirdest thing, aside from any of the astrology or astronomy, both of which are weird. In the middle of the day, it's night, and then it's day again. And in a way, this is what Jeff was describing, was that flip, that polarization from objective awareness to subjective. At night when the sun isn't out, I have to feel my way around because I can't see, so I can't use my regular measurement systems to know where I'm going. Instead, I need to rely on my emotions. Now, what's interesting about this eclipse, aside from the fact that it's occurring on the day, we've been here on new moons before and said, that was hot shit. But this is like even cooler, you know? But the thing that's particularly weird about this new moon eclipse is that the eclipse energy is a bit scattered and hyper and changeable and unpredictable. For those of you who know astrology, there's a Uranian influence to eclipses because the energy is other than normal. And in Gemini, it's even less grounded. However, this eclipse at 11 degrees of Gemini is within a half of a degree of being exactly trine to Saturn at 10.5 degrees of Libra. And if there's an opposite energy to the erratic, scattered, unpredictable description that I just gave, it would be Saturn. And it's a harmonious aspect, and herein lies the beauty and the oddity of today's eclipse.
Yeah, Rick and I often look at eclipses or talk about them with respect to their degree of difficulty. And the degree of difficulty of an eclipse largely has to do with what the other planets are doing to the eclipse point. And the fact that Saturn, the planet of order and structure and stability in Aries Libra, aligns in the most harmonious relationship possible with this new moon eclipse, suggests that we can make sense out of this craziness. Now, Gemini's got its own craziness. Of all the signs of the zodiac, there's probably none that is as itchy, nervous, restless, and diverse as Gemini, which I've often said, although it's called the sign of the twins, that really underestimates the multiplicity of Gemini. It's like the sign of the octuplets. It's the sign of multiple...
He's saying that because he's a Taurus, and anything over 2 is many.
It's too much. It's just... Exactly. Exactly. But it's interesting then, as Rick talked and brought Saturn into the picture, what I realized is that one of the challenges that we have with diversity and complexity is what's right. Do I follow this path or do I follow that path? And the fundamental message of Gemini is consider taking both paths. And the fact that the complexity of Gemini is multiplied by a new moon solar eclipse, and that Saturn, the guide, the limit, the furthest out planet of the solar system, is setting such clear and healthy boundaries, suggests the possibility that we get to bounce around with our internal and external contradictions in a way that's not necessarily crazy-making nor destructive, but in a way that broadens our consciousness and increases our capacity to function in the world. I mean, Rick was right, I'm a Taurus, and as such, what I usually try to do is simplify things. Give me 2 things, I want to try to boil it down to 1. But the fact is that what this is signaling is in those places in your life, in those places in yourself where you're trying to boil things down to 1, take that teapot off the stove, let it cool, and allow yourself to stay open to more than one possibility. Additionally, oh, go ahead.
No, it's fine.
Just to underscore this is Saturn, Saturn has sort of an equivalency to the moon, because the lunar cycle of 28, 29 days to the new moon is somewhat analogous to Saturn's 29-year cycle. And they are both containers. The moon, an inner container, Saturn, an external container, and in fact, they rule opposing signs. Saturn's associated with Capricorn, the moon is associated with Cancer, the opposite sign. And Saturn in Libra, not as diverse as Gemini, but nevertheless dualistic, suggests that order and structure, which Saturn represents, and trust, which Saturn builds, has to do with not holding one position, but being in a place where we can flexibly move between at least 2.
I was thinking when you were talking, Jeff, and you said, true, you're a Taurus, and this is indicative of the Gemini energy. What I realized is that we're coming from a place right now in our calendar, in our year, in our cycle, where you're not alone. We're all Tauruses. Granted, the sun moved out of Taurus 10, 11 days ago. The moon moved out of Taurus just a day ago. But we still have Mars and Venus and Mercury all hanging back in Taurus. And in fact, we'll talk more about this in a moment. On June 4th, we have Jupiter moving into Taurus, where it will stay for an entire year until next June. So in a way, we're all Tauruses right now, looking at this Gemini energy, which in some ways is it's a harbinger. It's a sign of what's to come, because over the next days and weeks, and if you watch here, I'm just going to move this forward and then backward again, because you'll see that over the next days, first Mercury moves into Gemini tomorrow, followed by Venus on June 9th, followed by Mars on June 20th.
Right.
So can you see how all these planets are moving from Taurus into Gemini? And in some ways, I'm just going to put this back where it was. In some ways, what this eclipse really is like a seed for what it is that will be stepping through over the next month, month and a half, as all of the faster moving planets move from I'm Taurus, this is where I am, and this is where I'm staying, because it feels good, and I'll stay here as long as I can get away with it until I have to move. But when I have to move, all of a sudden things are going to go into Gemini, then it's going to get really, really fast and speed it up, and the Tauruses are going to just have to deal with it, and the Geminis are going to feel like, oh, I'm home. Things aren't slow and stodgy and kind of contained in a way that maybe has been making some of the airy signs a little crazy by how much weight we've been dealing with at the speed things have been moving over these last few days, weeks.
We Tauruses will be fine as long as there are cookies in the world, so don't worry about us. But Rick,
or as Jeff likes to say, when the going gets tough, Taurus goes for a sandwich.
Big fat sandwich. But Rick, what I think you pointed out there is very interesting, because it gives us a chance to explore the difference between being, which are more about the sun and moon. I mean, the sun and moon are by far the dominant factors in astrology. They really represent the polarity of being or of consciousness. So we have this new moon, we have this Geminian sort of consciousness, but the means of analysis, which is Mercury, the means of evaluation, which is Venus, and the means of action, which are Mars, are lagging behind in Taurus, so that it's possible, and particularly tomorrow, when intellectual Mercury moves into Gemini, adding another puff of ideas and air to Gemini reality, we're going to be seeing a lot that we can't quite grasp yet. And while in the negative extreme sense, there can be a great deal of frustration. If you're the kind who's pushing forward and leading the parade, maybe it's the other people around you who you're going to think of as being the laggards, the sluggish ones holding you back. Or if you're the one who likes to plan and control and operate at a slower pace, you may feel that you are being rushed right now to make decisions or to address issues for which you are not ready. Perhaps what this means, however, is that the means, these tools of the inner planets, are still being sharpened in Taurus. You know, you can decide that you're going to go on a trip, or you're going to take on an event, like you're going to run a marathon or something, but you've got to get into shape first. You've got to prepare yourself for whatever it is you're doing. And I think if you find yourself frustrated because you're not ready and think you should be, or flip, you're being, you're ready and somebody isn't, instead of simply allowing yourself to be frustrated, which obviously isn't particularly useful, think of the tools, the instruments, and the resources that you may be developing more slowly to make the journey a richer and more fulfilling one.
And I think that as the planets move into Gemini, I think it's not quite as sudden a change as it might normally be, because these days, because Neptune, the fuzzy planet, has just recently moved into Pisces, what happens is that every time a planet moves into Gemini, first Mercury, then Venus, then Mars, on the 2nd, the 9th, and the 20th, what happens is, yes, they move into jumpy, jittery, restless Gemini, but they square Neptune, and it may take them a day or two to realize that things are jumpy and jittery because they're on drugs.
Right. It's
good drugs.
Well, Neptune represents the dissolving of boundaries like drugs, and while it's like expecting to go into something cool like Gemini, and you get blasted with some warm, moist air. So because, as Rick pointed out, Neptune is at the beginning of Pisces with every planet entering Gemini. First, it doesn't get that clarity, but it hits the diffusive and confusing Neptunian energies. Or it can also mean that Gemini is an air sign. It's intellectual. It operates out of the mind with a high degree of abstraction. And you go, I have this idea. I have this idea. I'm going to do this thing. And you go into it and you're taken by an experience which you can't rationalize or intellectualize. That's part of Neptune's job. The fuzziness or the confusion of Neptune is meant to a certain extent to take us out of our mental bodies and put us into something that's not describable, but much richer on a feeling level.
And while we're both approving of and dumping on Neptune, let's just also throw out two other things. One is that when any of these planets square Neptune, the temptation is to escape. Not just with drugs, but even with meditation.
Or
and those
prayer.
drugs, or
prayer.
Or prayer. Or anything, or dreams, or imagination. And so sometimes that Neptune square can be enough to prevent us from dealing with what's real and what's right in front of us. But there's another thing that's developing here as a background note. I mentioned it a few moments ago, and that was the fact that on June 4th, Jupiter moves from Aries into Taurus, where it remains for an entire year. Jupiter is a 12-year cycle. It stays in each sign about a year, and its yearly visit, or its once every 12-year visit into Taurus, begins on the 4th. But remember, just like all those planets that moved into Gemini and squared Neptune, creating that tension between the jumpy, jittery, analytical interactivity of Gemini and the spaced out, vision, dreams, imagination of Neptune. Well, when Jupiter moves into Taurus, it creates a harmonious sextile. This is not a square. This is not jumpy, jittery. It's a supportive aspect, and it's an aspect between Jupiter in grounded, stabilizing Taurus and the vision of Neptune. And this becomes, I think, our secret weapon for this part of the month, because it really enables us to ground out that totally spaced out and sometimes very cosmic and beautiful dream image of Neptune.
Yeah, the slower moving outer planets don't make contacts with one another all that often. So the harmonious relationship, the 60-degree sextile with expansive Jupiter and diffusive expansive Neptune, represents an opportunity for awareness. Now, the difference between Jupiter and Neptune is Jupiterian awareness is philosophical. It is within the realm of ordinary consciousness, particularly with Jupiter moving into earthy Taurus. Jupiter in Taurus might suggest, harmonized with Neptune, that our materialist philosophies, Taurus is earth, therefore associated with materialism. Doesn't mean we're greedy pigs, but it may mean that you want to sort of measure your progress, your spirituality, your learning, and your personal growth in concrete ways. Well, what Neptune does is it infuses it with spirit. that this harmonious relationship of Jupiter and Neptune, just as Rick said, what Neptune can do, this diffusive planet in its home sign of Pisces, formerly the home sign of Jupiter, and to many astrologers still strongly associated with Jupiter, suggests the possibility that the most diffuse dreams can connect themselves with a plan, Jupiter in Taurus, and that the mundane things that we aspire to and wish for, Jupiter in Taurus, are again enriched with spirit, enriched with imagination. And maybe the real gift of this is that our look at the material world, because we say as soon as Jupiter goes into Taurus, truth is something that tends to be measured in more concrete material terms. But what Neptune is offering there is an opportunity to sort of lift the cover up on the illusion of materiality, to help us almost see the cosmic energy, the atomic structure, or the underlying movement, which is the matrix in which materialism exists.
So it's almost like Jupiter going into Taurus, Jupiter expansion, Taurus the sign of the material world, money, nice things. Jupiter in Taurus is this idea, this greedy idea, that money grows on trees. and we become oink, 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 oink. We become these little piggies. But instead of being pigs that are like wanting material things, what Neptune does is it turns the oink, 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 oink into oink. Oink. I don't know where the hell that came from.
No, that's great. I don't think we can do better than that. Thank you so much for coming. No, that's brilliant because it encapsulates, you know, I blah, blah, Rick blah, blah, and a little oink sort of encapsulates things in a way that we can't otherwise do. And maybe on a psychological level, what that means is where you're selfish and greedy, where you are a little piggy, that rather than shutting down in the greed or beating yourself up for that greed, forgive yourself for it. Neptune is very much about forgiveness. Neptune is about placing something in a larger spiritual context. If you're greedy and piggy and selfish and who isn't somewhere sometime, I'm not saying that that's a desirable trait that we want to continue, but anything in Taurus that you push again will resist you with twice the force you push it with. That's very much the nature of Taurus. But when you forgive in that place of stubbornness, even when it's greedy, perhaps then we recognize that the world is more bountiful than we thought. And we can open up and breathe and be a little bit more generous with ourselves.
So, we have Jupiter moving into Taurus on June 5th. Then it actually perfects the exact sextile with Neptune on June 8th. On June 9th, Venus moves into Gemini. And all of these so far that we've talked about are all lightning. I don't mean like Uranus, lightning striking. I mean like bleach, like light. And so Venus moves into Gemini on the 9th. And then on June 12th, Saturn, which has been retrograde since December, late December. Saturn, more?
Probably January or so.
December, January is when Saturn turned retrograde. But now Saturn is stops its retrograde motion and it turns direct on June 12th. And again, this is also a lightening of the energy on some level. The containment is now moving again forward.
Right. When planets move from retrograde, the apparent backwards motion, to forward, the apparent direct motion, it makes their energies more accessible. It's easier to be overt in expressing them. Direct or forward motion, while we think of Saturn as resistant, Saturn is a very constructive planet. Libra is a cardinal or season-initiating sign. So those Saturnian things you've been wanting to do, the big tasks, the big projects, the structures, the discipline that you've been waiting for, Saturn turning direct, shifts the current of constructive behavior, particularly constructive behavior involving others. Saturn's in Libra, the sign of relationships, and it begins to allow us, I think, to execute more skillfully.
And as Saturn turns direct during those days, the moon is also growing closer toward full moon.
Right.
And it's only a couple of days later, on the 15th, well, that's my math, 12, 13, 14, 15. Three's a couple, isn't it? We're in Seattle. Three's a couple. Okay, so a couple of days later, 3 days later, the full moon on June 15th is the second eclipse. Normally, eclipses come in pairs. Normally, eclipses are at the full moon and the new moon when the plane of the moon and the earth are similar to the plane of the sun, so that at the new moon, the moon is in front of the sun, and at the full moon, the earth casts a shadow directly onto the moon. Now, normally, if there's a new moon eclipse, it's followed by a full moon eclipse, and vice versa. We have a new moon eclipse today, followed by a full moon eclipse in 2 weeks, but we have a rare occurrence of another new moon eclipse on July 1st that we'll get to in a moment. So it's normally the second and final eclipse in a 2-eclipse sequence. This time round is just the middle eclipse.
This eclipse, like all lunar eclipses, and this is a total lunar eclipse, all lunar eclipses are full moons, oppositions between the sun and moon, and normally this one, the dialogue is, the moon in Sagittarius is, I want to go for broke. I want to bet it all on one horse, one course.
Reach for the sky.
Right, reach for the sky for Sagittarius. Perfect. Where Gemini wants to have several eggs and many baskets. Well, Dane Rujar said that in a lunar eclipse, the present, as represented by the Earth, casts a shadow on the moon and says, let go of something of the past. It's a bit of the reversal of the solar eclipse. Well, Sagittarius is aspirations, as Rick said, shooting for the moon, philosophical beliefs.
Reaching for the stars.
Right, reaching for the stars, what your truth is. And that in this eclipse, and by the way, timing of eclipses is nutty because schools of thought of astrology will vary from a matter of weeks to months, in some cases 6 months.
You mean as to how long the effects of the eclipse last?
The
eclipse itself, there's no argument about that.
Right.
The argument is about when does an eclipse have impact in your life? And as Jeff was saying, there are some people who believe that eclipses are timing very weird because they set up a sensitive point in your chart and they can begin having impact weeks or months before and or weeks and months after the actual eclipse itself.
So this eclipse of a moon in Sagittarius can cast a shadow over your beliefs and your expectations and what you hold to be true. And although that can be a terrifying moment or experience for some people, it can also be incredibly liberating and empowering. To be told that you're wrong and go, okay, can be an awesome relief for those who hold on very strongly to that notion that they have to be right. And I think long term with Neptune, a planet of spirituality and a truth beyond language or intellect in Pisces, the great sea of the collective unconscious, it may mean that there are many more answers for us when we don't know. It is the richness of the empty moment that I think Neptune in Pisces represents, and certainly an eclipse of the moon in Sagittarius may make us feel dumb enough to where we wished we were empty.
Yeah, I have that bumper sticker on my car that says, hire Sagittarians and Aquarians because they know everything.
Right.
Between them.
All right. Go ahead.
Well, the day after the eclipse, we begin another wave of energy that becomes a very significant and powerful. I see Aquarians in the back of the room, kind of.
Who let them in here?
Well, actually, my
Security.
It's actually insecurity. Insecurity. My first thought was that they were laughing at how true it was, and then I realized, no, they think it's bullshit.
Right.
They know everything. The day after the eclipse, on June 16th, Mercury becomes the first planet. Oh, I'm stepping this here by a minute instead of a day. That'll take forever. There's way too. There we go. Mercury becomes the first planet in the cluster of the sun. You see, Mercury and Venus always cluster around the sun, and every other year Mars spends quite a bit of time clustering around the sun also. So it's not uncommon to have the sun, Mercury, Venus, and Mars in the same sign or within a couple of signs of each other. Mercury now becomes the leading planet in this, and while the sun is still in Gemini, Mercury on the 16th, thank you, becomes the first planet to move into Cancer. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about Cancer in a few minutes because it's followed in a few days by the summer solstice and the sun moving into Cancer. But what we want to make a mental note of here, and for those of you who are repeat offenders, this is a monthly theme that we've been talking about and will continue to be talking about over the months and years ahead. And that is, as planets move into Cancer, they're going to pick up on squares to Uranus and oppositions to Pluto. Uranus and Pluto moving very slowly, and the two of them coming closer and closer and closer into an exact square, and they hold that pattern for much of 2012, 2013, and 2014. And so when Mercury moves into Cancer, it becomes the first planet to begin to pick up on that, uh-oh, something else is going on here.
Yeah, and that's not what Cancer wants.
What does Cancer want, Jeff?
Cancer wants familiarity. Cancer wants the cuddly, familiar patterns of safety, security. You brought up insecurity. That certainly Cancer is about seeking security and comfort. And we tend to seek it by going to familiar places rather than going to unfamiliar places.
Like mom's breast.
That's right.
Well, and I say
Leave
that
my mother out of this, you know. Go to your own mom's breast, Rick. I'm sorry.
But, you know, Cancer it's the nurturing. It is the baby in the womb and the baby at the breast. This is the mother's nurturing love that Cancer actually protects and feeds that which or those whom it loves.
It's about identity that comes from roots or source. That way of knowing ourselves, which is not in the moment, but has a historical or emotional thread to the past, to family. But because when planets go into Cancer, as Rick pointed out, Mercury in a couple of days, 3-4 days, will move into a right angle with Uranus, which is the planet of weird and strange. It's like no family you've ever met, you've ever had, because even if you come from the biggest freak show of a family on the planet, what Uranus then for you would be like walking into a 1950s conservative Republican household, which would freak the hell out of you. Because Uranus is neither left nor right nor up nor down.
It's other than normal for you.
Exactly. So all of us are going to have this process of first intellectually led by Mercury, then followed by the Sun, which will track a little bit
and then
here.
First Mercury then opposes Pluto, still before the Sun.
Right. So that's an interesting question. As we've often pointed out, the larger, slower moving patterns, and Uranus square Pluto is the biggie. It's not exact until next year, 2012, but when faster moving planets hit big, slow moving waves, they often trigger the events or the psychological experiences associated with those waves. And what they are is that Uranus in Aries is that impulse to create or to explore a totally fresh and new experience. And Pluto in Capricorn is the desire to exercise absolute control over the environment So you won't have to be surprised by anything. So this journey that we're going through, first with Mercury and then with the Sun, before we finally get into Cancer, free of those two weird planets, can be a kind of emotional or an experiential roller coaster of crazy, weird, unpredicted, clamping down and grabbing on. Now, the purpose of saying this is not to say you're going to have a hard time. Hopefully you won't experience it in that way. But in case you do, as is, I think, the value of astrological prediction is to go, oh, this is on schedule. And if I'm a little freaked out and then get super intense and mad at somebody for moving my coffee cup to the hook next to the one that I've kept it on for the last 5 years, they damn well know it belongs there, and therefore I'm going to kill them, well, you might recognize this as a bit of an overreaction.
Before we move on to the summer solstice, and that's the sun moving into Cancer, just want to make a note here as we get to this June 18th, 19th period. We move through the month, and it's like if you just look at all the aspect lines in the middle, there's a lot of shit going on here. I mean, everything seems to be connected with everything else, and there's a high level of noise. We have on the 17th, we have Venus making an exact trine with Saturn. This is a grounding, stabilizing energy. We have also Mercury, as it moved into Cancer, it's going to make that harmonizing trine with Neptune before it runs into all of this other messy stuff that it does. So there's a lot of things going on, and we're just kind of glossing over some of them. But then, as it does every year on the first moment of summer, the changing of the seasons, the sun moves into the sign of Cancer. This is the time at when it is aligned with the Tropic of Cancer, the Tropic of Capricorn. These are real lines of latitude that actually are drawn in black magic marker around the Earth, except on the Pacific Ocean, where it's like a little buoy line around the Earth. But the sun, at this point in time, from our perspective here, the sun just doesn't move around the zodiac as we move around it. It also has an upward and downward motion. And on the day that the sun ingresses or moves into the sign of Cancer, that is the time at which the sun is at its northernmost latitude. In other words, it becomes the longest daylight day of the year here in Seattle. This is the day that we put light in the bank for all of October, November, December, January, and we take it out of the bank this time of year, and we're making our maximum light withdrawals, if you will, on the first day of summer, on the summer solstice, when the sun moves into the sign of Cancer.
So that longest day of the year is followed by the sun making a square or right angle to Uranus on the 26th, which is rebellion. The sun can also be the monarch, the authority, whether yourself, your boss, whoever you project that solar central role upon. And the square to Uranus, a right angle, can be the fall of authority, the fall of your own internal authority. And then the sun opposes Pluto the day after, the 27th. That is a rocky road. To have the sun, the body representing consciousness in the maternal, protective, warming sign of Cancer, sort of go through this rogue's territory of Uranus and Pluto, can certainly represent some rather complex stuff. But it keeps going. The eclipses that we talked about earlier, the first one was harmonized. Today's eclipse was harmonized with Saturn. The lunar eclipse didn't have any hard or harsh aspects or planetary connections to it. The next eclipse, which is occurring, we're going to go into July because we're not going to be back here until the 6th of July is our next presentation. But that eclipse, which is occurring at 9 degrees of Cancer, is hooked up in the big transformational waves. The 1960s revisited. The 1960s we're Uranus-Pluto conjunction. The squares coming up 2012 to 2015 are the next stage or phase in that process. And this eclipse hits them.
And just look here, even though the degrees aren't exact, we have now a grand square here with Uranus at 4 degrees of cardinal Aries, the eclipse, the sun and the moon at 9 degrees, Saturn at 10 degrees of cardinal Libra, and Pluto at 6 degrees of cardinal Capricorn. And so this eclipse sucks. Wired for sound.
Well,
no, this is not an easy eclipse. I mean,
it's an extremely difficult eclipse.
I didn't want to be so negative.
Well, difficult doesn't necessarily mean negative. Difficult means difficult, but if you want to process a lot, if you want to condense 5 years of psychotherapy into a couple of days of sheer terror, screaming, ecstasy, and a complete spectrum of emotional experience, we've got an opportunity to do that. Now, saying that's fun, that's what we astrologers do, the fact is that it's going to vary according to what's going on in your chart. It's going to vary according to your own process, and it's not necessarily going to make your life crazy that day. But the thing is this, I think we have, particularly with the sun in Cancer, a natural instinct, right, to hold on tight, to hold on to identity, the psyche, our home, our family.
The past.
The past, absolutely. And so there's a lot of motivation to suppress the weird stuff that's coming up. And yet, suppressing stuff is pretty expensive. It's expensive in that, one, you may miss an opportunity to make some breakthroughs that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do except with ayahuasca, or that you just sort of shut yourself down. The seed points of disease, according to some theorists, and that makes sense, has to do with where we've shut down, that we crystallize energy because we're unwilling to face or feel whatever it represents. So while we're not recommending that you necessarily do anything overly impulsive and crazy, it would be helpful to allow yourself a bit more extremes in some healthy or safe ways in your life.
And although we've already tipped into July, I think Jeff's words are very helpful and accurate here. But I just want to make a note that there are 2 things that are actually helping, 3 things really, that even though this is a stressful pattern, we have a very slow-moving aspect of Saturn moving into,
Jupiter.
I'm sorry, thank you, of Jupiter moving into a harmonious trine with Pluto, which again, it's almost like this becomes Jupiter to the rescue. This is a stabilizing factor that takes the pressure off of this square in a way that says if we grow slowly and stably, that we actually can go through the change without just nuking it all or having a nervous breakdown or a psychological fugue or a schizophrenic experience or whatever. That's one piece. The other piece is that Mars is already coming into, even though it's not exact for a few days later, it's pushing into a harmonious trine with Saturn. And here again, we have another stabilizing piece, as we do from Venus, which will change signs in a couple of days and then come into a trine with Neptune. And so we have, which is visionary and loving of, it's kind of the awareness of the beauty that exists on the high road, if you will. Yeah. And I don't mean high road, I mean the metaphysical, cosmic high road. But each of these 3 things, I think, add, I heard a groan of disappointment from back then. But I do think that what happens here is that this difficult eclipse actually has some pieces that allow us with awareness and consciousness to move through it without necessarily having things fall apart.
I think that's great information and really helpful information. So don't let the craziness or whatever it is that you're feeling lead you to forget that you have means to respond. Mars, the action planet in Gemini, dualistic, trine Saturn, is like a race car driver, someone who can stay on the track under rather unpredictable conditions. So thank you, Rick, for bringing up all the resources that we have to go with this. All right, that covers it. What we're going to do is, for anyone who would like us to look at their chart, Rick and I do mini readings. We use your chart as a demonstration piece to humiliate you in front of the whole group. It's not for your own well-being, but no, it's demonstrative. If you want us to look at your chart, we have a drawing. We will look at 3 charts, put your first name, your time, date, and place of birth, leave it on the table here behind Julie. We'll pick out 3 of them.
Hat.
Oh, the hat behind Julie. And we'll
the hat by Julie's butt.
After about a 10-minute break, we will take a look at those. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you all. And just a quick reminder, Jeff and I do these monthly, first Wednesday night of each month at SoulFood as part of the local community. If you want to support the community, do your Christmas shopping tonight. No, seriously. The way that the store stays in operation is from the things that are sold here, whether it's books or coffee or pastries. Please don't hold back. Feel free to patronize our hosts. It's why we get to come here every month. And thank you, SoulFood, for being here. And thank you, Craig, for making outrageous coffee. And Lily. Is Lily back there? And John, who's floating around here somewhere. That's it. We're done now. See you in 10 or 15.
Good stuff on the support for the eclipse.
Good.